Thank you. I would now like to welcome our first panel of the Sunday session of Armadacon this year. And what we have is a wonderful lineup. At the far end we have David Wake.
Hey.
Who's not awake?
David not yet awake.
Yeah.
David is awake.
Who put me on this panel?
You did.
On the programme man, we have in the middle Beth.
Hey.
I'm playing referee today, Mark.
Well, up until 10 minutes ago, when Dave actually decided that he's got nothing to talk about and he should moderate the panel instead. So now it's his panel, not my panel.
Correct. We now have two well-renowned writers.
Yeah.
And Dave as referee.
Yeah.
That's only so you can sleep.
I'm going to ask one question and then nod off.
Over to you.
I am David Wake, and I'm putting that out very early on so Mark can cut it out of the podcast. This is being recorded, so if you don't wish to appear on a podcast, don't laugh or react in any way whatsoever, and don't ask any questions.
Just like every other panel.
Yes, we had an argument about who was moderating, and I wanted it to be me because I have nothing to say, so I can ask questions. You see, I am writing a fantasy trilogy at the moment, and I've got my wonderful guests to tell me how to do it.
I'd like to respectfully suggest that as Tracy's writing also contains mostly folklore, that she should slip into this panel as well.
A good plan. Someone get a chair for her.
Well, behind you.
Oh, right. Well, I'll move along with it. Move along.
And now Beth and I only have to say 2/3 the amount of stuff that we were going to have to say on a Sunday morning panel. Where are you going?
Sorry, I was stitched up.
Yeah. That wasn't even pretty flat.
But you did this such stuff.
So,
I know exactly what I'm doing.
folklore and its influences on SF and fantasy. Go.
Can we start by defining folklore?
Well, why don't we quickly introduce ourselves? I can't say it because you can't cut me out. David Wake.
Can I just interrupt before you do start?
Yes.
Not interrupting you. If anybody hasn't got anything from Mark Burrows, I've got to get him on a train in about 45 minutes. He's having breakfast now. So I apologise if it's in the middle of your talk, but if you want to get it, you've only got the next sort of hour to do it in.
So,
That's fine as long as you get hours afterwards.
Rush there really quickly. As I said, David Wake, I'm writing a fantasy trilogy and thinking about how to use folklore and magic and sense walking my books. That's my introduction there.
I am Beth Webb, and I have written the Star Dancer Quartet, which is about the end of the Iron Age, early Roman period, and I used as much mythology and folklore which are interrelated as I could, but because history is written by the victors, i.e. the Romans, it was their perception of what the late Iron Age culture was, and so I looked at as many old stories as I could. Given that these were written down by monks, because the Druids thought writing was beneath them, writing was words that stay, and therefore it freezes the meaning and the ideas. So it's quite difficult finding the folklore to use. But as I say, I took the stories and I took as much Roman history as I could, and I sort of back-engineered it to try and find some roots, sort of. I tried.
I'm Mark, you know that. I don't really write fiction because my brain doesn't work in that way. I have written one folklore-based short story, which is based on my black dog folklore research very strongly, so therefore I didn't write a lot of it, it was already kind of written. I used that as a basis for a fictional Lovecraftian retelling of folklore that already existed. It worked, but it's like I could have written about 3 non-fiction books in the time it took me to get that story right. So I don't do that anymore. So I work with folklore as it exists, as a folklorist and the cultural interpretation of those stories. And the way that they're interpreted in terms of fiction, what Beth does and what Tracy's done with some of her writing is equally as valid, because folklore is storytelling at the end of the day.
I'm Tracy, and as well as the sort of historical side of folklore, I used to write for the Moor London newspaper, so I would look out obscure bits of Dartmoor, primarily folklore, and bring those back into life. I also, if I can, with my writing, try to weave in some of my folkloric interests. So, for example, there is a very strong thread of folkloric interest through Anna Stenberg. So, if I can get it in there, I will. It's either witches or vampires.
So is that, I mean, how much of this is using myth to create the story, and how much is it sort of simply in the background? Beth, yours is very well researched, detailed background. So how much was the myth merely part of the wallpaper almost, and how much was driving the story and creating the stories?
Well, I had a fairly clear story for Star Dancer in my head. It was about when the Romans are invading, the Druids are looking for a solution, and so they're looking for somebody they can train up as a sort of mixture between Gandalf and Goliath. Someone who can actually stand at the head of a warband and wave a sword and do magic. Now, I wrote one very important rule at the beginning: the Druids did not fight. They were often battle druids, and they would be like Moses, and they would hold their hands up, and as long as their hands were held up, then their side would win, and if their arms ached, you'd prop me up on either side. That goes all across, as I said, it's in the Bible, Moses did it, and the battle druids did it. So I broke that rule, but hey, I'm a storyteller. And then I started to research how the story would take place. I went to everywhere that my character went and stood there and took notes, and I breathed and I imagined and I daydreamed. And then I started to write, but then I realized I didn't know how people think, and the psychology of how people think and their sociology of how they interact was very important to me. So I went back to very early Celtic myths, or as many as I could find, and then I found that the mythology and the folklore actually gave me new ideas. So in a sense the story came first, but the folklore put flesh on the bones and also helped me redesign the bones.
So would you say then that myth started to come into the storytelling to give it more depth and more meaning?
It gave it more depth, more meaning, but also it changed the structure, because I realized as I went on that certain things couldn't or wouldn't have happened. And so I either decided to fudge it when it's only a story, like having a Goliath, Gandalf-y combined character, because this isn't an academic book, it's a story meant to entertain. But it did change the structure, because I realised there were other possibilities, and that other things didn't work quite as well, and they worked better if you followed the, as best as I could understand it, traditional structure. You look worried, and I'm not making sense.
No, I'm thinking.
I'd like to see you write battle druids versus battle droids. As a piece of fan.
Oh, next year.
That would be excellent.
You should do that.
Which robot or person can keep their arms in the air longest? I'm going to, Tracy.
Yes.
How do you put myth into fiction? Because I'm going to leave Mark till last, because he's just going to tell how it is.
Okay, let's see, when I wrote Witch, my play, basically everything in that was cherry-picked from people's actual lived experience. So the folklore, the superstitions, everything was taken from examples that I found in my research and kind of stitched together Frankenstein-like to produce a flowing narrative of the most unfortunate woman in the history of witchcraft accusations, because everything that could have gone wrong with her life did, as a way of showing what people were actually going through. With Anna, slightly different. Part of Anna is based on a real-life crime which happened between 1847 and 1849. I mentioned on Friday night that there is some vagueness about whether or not the person responsible died after a year or after a number of years. And so I've taken that kind of grey area and thought, okay, let's forget all the reports that say he died a year after he finished his sentence. Let's have a look instead at this Australian, bizarrely, newspaper covering this French story, which said that he was still alive in 1878. What would he have been doing in all that time? And so I was able to take, because the crime itself was connected to, see, I can't give too much detail away because it's a massive spoiler. So the crime is connected to a folkloric element, and so that enabled me to bring in a lot of the superstitions surrounding that particular folklore, how you deal with it, what it manifests as, protection and things like that. So I was able to bring all of those things in. I always knew that there was going to be an element of folklore and superstition and mythology in this book. But when I kind of cast around to find a good story to base it on and thought, hang on a minute, I've got the perfect one. It was one that I knew already from previous research that I'd done. And when I was looking back into it, because I'd not touched it for a good number of years, and I found a reference to this article that said, in 1878, this chap was doing this. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, didn't he die at like 1850? This is like 28 years later. That's interesting. So I had a little bit of a look into that. But it was great because it enabled me to do exactly what I wanted, because there was enough of a time gap and enough of a grey area that I could have, anything could happen. So
was the folklore element part of the background, or did it drive the structure and the plot of the story?
It drove the plot,
right,
very much.
Drove it as a MacGuffin, or drove it as an outline to follow the same folklore myth?
In some ways, probably I would say the latter, because it's, once you've established what's going on, that particular line of folklore does take a very sort of standard, right, we've got this problem, superstition and tradition tells us that we have to do X, Y and Z in order to get rid of it, so that is what we are going to do. So there was a degree of driving the plot that way, but there is also a background, not necessarily connected to that particular plot, the 1847-1849 crime. It's not necessarily connected directly to that. I've got to be so vague here, it's really difficult.
But it is, your characters in stories are driven or controlled by their beliefs and superstitions. So if there are myths in their world, that's going to affect what they think and therefore what they do. We have to now move on to Mark, who's going to talk about real myths. What towards Shane?
No, not at all. I mean, this is exactly what folklore is. The beauty of folklore, and if those that were here last year, or the year before even, I can't remember when it was, who saw my Scooby-Doo and folklore talk will know that I make this point in there as well as in other places as well. Is that there aren't any kind of right answers to this, because folklore isn't about taking these myths, superstitions, ghosts, werewolves, vampires, all the things we had in the quiz last night, and saying those aren't actual things. Let us now prove or disprove that those. We don't care. Folklorists don't care about that. That's the realm of other, scientists, paranormal investigators, are trying to prove that something exists. What folklore is interested in is why these stories hang around, how they change and develop, and then culturally what they mean to different people. Because folklore is a language of symbols, for a start. And so you can take anything in this room, and identify it to you, what a chair is, what it's for, what a table is for. But until you ascribe your cultural meaning to that, it's just an object. And the same applies in folklore. It can mean different things to different communities. So it's about your cultural identity, your sense of belonging to a community, to a place. It's who you are. Everybody interacts with folklore and deals with folklore every day, multiple times, without even thinking about it, because it's what makes you, part of the folklore, part of the community.
We're at a science fiction convention, and that's all about the folklore of science fiction fandom.
This is a folk group. Yeah. So folk groups are where groups of people share a common belief or a common identity. That is known as a folk group. So knitters are a folk group. Singers are a folk group. Armadacon conventionists are a folk group. You share a belief, and the folk groups have been described within folklore as being any size other than one, essentially. So if two or more people share a belief in something, then you are a folk group. And that's what applies to everybody here.
So, what do you mean by people who study folklore are not interested in its origins or it came from? Because I, as a sort of scientific background, would like to know where this myth came from. What was the message of it?
Yeah, that's a different thing. We are interested in its origins. What we're not interested in is its truthfulness necessarily. Whether it exists as an actual thing or as a concept. The problem with origins in folklore is that generally they are impossible to condemn. Really, really hard to show where a particular thing comes from. Not always. And people have a misconception of folklore, for example, that it's old stuff. Yeah, old superstitions, traditions, why you do things to protect yourself from whatever you're protecting yourself from. Those sorts of things. But it's not. Digital folklore is very much a thing. Modern folklore is very much a thing. You create folklore every day. AI is creating folklore.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories, absolutely. If you've come across Lob or Lobe in terms of AI art, this is this female humanoid type creature whose face has started appearing in different sorts of AI generated art. This is folklore. Was Lobe created by one person, and AI, as it scrapes, is then recreating this face in other places? Is it purely a construct, in the same way as conspiracy theory is arguably a construct? Where did it come from originally? We can't say for certain, but in other ones like Slender Man, we do know exactly. So Slender Man, we know the origin point, we know who created Slender Man, where and how it was created. It was created as a creepypasta story. But then from there, it gets shared and circulated, and then over time, people start to forget about that origin point and are not sure whether Slender Man was a genuine paranormal superstitious thing or not. And then it goes to extremes, and we have the tragic stabbing instance in Wisconsin with the schoolgirls who stabbed a fellow schoolgirl. She survived, fortunately. 19 wounds, yeah. She survived, but they did it because they believed that Slender Man had told them to do it.
They wanted to be Slender Man proxies,
Yeah.
so working on his behalf.
Yeah.
But part of the Slender Man myth was that if you did not do this thing, Slender Man would knew where you lived and would come and get your family.
So the
they
lines,
genuinely believed that.
Yeah. The lines become very much blurred then, and as you move through the years, people are not sure whether this actually was a genuine thing or.
And this is something I'm very interested in teasing my fiction, is how myths start and why they go there. Yeah.
Myths and folklore, lore spelt this way, L-O-R-E, means instruction. Yeah.
Correct.
So, and folk is this group, two or more, with a common idea. So it's instruction to the group. Now, psychologically, when we're children or uneducated people, we have no knowledge. We feel powerless. And that powerlessness is seriously scary. So you'll often see that sports personalities have a certain sock or an amulet or something. I mean, this is quite well known. Like my star dancer, she comes into her magical powers when somebody gives her a green silk scarf, and coincidentally when she dances with the green silk scarf, she feels better, she feels more in control of things, and things start to go right for her. So she believes, dancing with the green silk scarf will make things work and work as they need to work. And at the end of the story, just before the climax, somebody steals her green silk scarf and effectively disempowering her. She overcomes that and realizes that what she has got to do is more important, and something is in her, not in the totem object, the green silk scarf. So mythology and folklore often comes from accident. You know, you're wearing an odd pair of socks the day things that go right, so you always wear odd socks.
And then as that moves on, you can't not do it, because you can't tempt fate. And I don't know, you do a straw poll, and I'm sure there are plenty of people here with, are the people who have to put their left shoe on before their right shoe, for example, something like that, or you have other little superstitions. Do you salute a magpie? Do you not walk under a ladder?
Let's do it.
Switch a light on to all three
Hands
times.
up if you do something that is ludicrously superstitious. Well, I don't know.
So that's got to be at least 2/3 of the room. At least
Yeah,
two-thirds.
and the other people didn't understand the question because I didn't phrase it very well. I mean, I just remembered something from our university days. We used to have big parties in the flat where I was, and we started to put out this ritual of taking little whales, which is a big rock, taking it to the street, throwing it in, and then persuading someone to get it back out again. And this grew in size each time we did it. We ended up with rows and a chant that we had to do. We were drunk students. But it struck me that that was the start of a religion. It would have taken nothing to add a bit of lore, and off we would go. And 10 years later, no one would know the origins of people drunk and said, let's throw this in the river.
It's happened lots of times. If you go onto Twitter now being November 2023, and look up dusking, that is a new ritual which has been done this year, which is likely to embed itself. Doc Rowe, who's a very, very well-known collector of folklore and tradition, has been filming folklore and performance for 60 years now, massive archives disappearing. He once created one of these things with some of his friends, and after, I think it was the 5th year of doing it, newspapers were starting to report it as being a 600-year-old ritual. And he was delighted. It only took 5 years for it to become a 600-year-old ritual because of one piece of misreporting. There's one from the floor.
Bernard Pearson said that if you do something 1 year, it's tradition. If you do something the second year repeat it, it's a long. Can anyone remember the exact
tradition needs to miss its time.
Well, you get to 5 years, it's the blossom that missed the time.
Yeah.
So to repeat that, in case we haven't caught it, if you do it 1 year, it's tradition. And if you do it 2 years on the row, it's steeped in the mist of time.
Yeah.
I always wear odd socks, but it's purely because one had to be cut off of me once, and I felt sorry for its partner.
Now there's a story in that. You could easily turn that into a fairy tale.
Yeah. Socks are a good one. Darren Brown, for example, only wears black socks.
Well, always wearing the same socks makes falling them and putting them together.
That's exactly the reason why.
It's like Jack
When the one
Goldblum
wears
did that,
out, then you
like,
haven't gone non-stop.
Well, I want to ask a question. We've just talked about sort of the origins of things. And it's quite shocking, isn't it, that something can, after 6 years, become steep and this time, etc., and slender man and so forth. But why does some myths gain a bit of traction and others don't? I'm very interested in that because, sorry, you're going to have to cut my name out again, but I'm David Wake. My ancestor is Hereward the Wake. And Hereward the Wake was a real historical figure. He fought the Normans. He was a nutcase. And a myth started to develop around his life. So mythical stories started to be added to what he did. So there's a story about him disguising himself as a washerwoman in order to escape. Some hundreds of years later, another character who may or may not have been historical, Robin Hood, took off as a mythical figure. And stories from Hereward the Wake's life, or myths associated with his life, got transferred to Robin Hood. So Robin Hood has a story of disguising himself as a washerwoman, escaping. Now, unless that's a really useful way of escaping, he nicked bits of Hereward the Wake's story.
And Bonnie Prince Charlie disguised himself as a washerwoman.
Right.
So did Mr. Toad.
So the question is, why did Mr. Toad and Robin Hood take off as mythical figures, and Hereward the Wake and Bonnie Prince Charlie didn't? That's my question.
Bonnie Prince Charlie is pretty much a mythical figure in Scotland. I mean, you get taught a lot about Bonnie Prince Charlie in school, at primary school, and they never mention the whole Protestant Catholic thing. So I knew a ton about Bonnie Prince Charlie, but I did not know that the Jacobite rebellion was anything to do with religion, because the school is creating the sanitised version of the... You're Scottish, you
Well,
mean a Scottish hero.
That's a different question we go on to, is
Yeah.
artificially modifying myths for political
Yeah,
reasons.
But the first difference with your characters is that Hereward the Wake
Yep.
and Bonnie Prince Charlie are historical figures. Robin Hood and Mr. Toad are fictional characters.
Robin Hood possibly existed.
Possibly, but
Well,
we
Robin
can't...
Hood is supposed to be
but
based
we
on
can't-
5 different outlaws.
Yes, we can't evidence Robin Hood as the story tells him as being a person. It is possibly a number of people. It is possibly a concept based on the behaviours of 1 or 2 people. We can't...
Interesting little thing that I do research into things in the museum, my local museum, and I was researching folklore, and came across a tale about a local outlaw. The fact that the word Rob Hood was a generic name for an outlaw. And this was used well before the time of the historical Robin Hood, if he existed.
So that's part of it, but the other part of it as to why things stick around is very much to do with resonance. It's to do with this idea of identity. If you culturally identify with parts of the story, if it resonates with you for particular reasons,
Like
and others around you, like empowerment, as you say in the examples in your books, then that will naturally transmit and develop, because within a community, within a folk group, if you like, other people will identify with it in the same way. Stories that don't have that kind of hook that you identify with, or those around you identify with, will either transmit somewhere else and become part of another culture's mythos, or they'll die away.
I mean, there is a natural selection that goes on with folks and stories and things. Richard Dawkins, who was a great biologist who's talked about natural selection and evolution, came up with the word meme to describe an idea and how natural selection... Sorry?
I didn't. Somebody else did. I forget the
All right, not him, but I'm talking about in his book.
Susan Blackmore.
Susan Blackmore.
Okay, and memes are ideas that will be affected by natural selection. So if you've got two jokes told in the bar, the better joke will be the one that's told the next day, and so forth.
Actually, there's another thing as well which does it. Place names or specific old sites just pull folklore and myths to them. The pyramids is a prime example. You see how many theories, Stonehenge, you know, they just pull myths and legends towards them like a magnet.
You know, everybody knows it was built by the Atlantean
whale people from outer space.
Yes.
Well, some people think it's Doctor Who.
They just repurposed an alien spaceship landing platform.
Yeah.
Which was the alien whale people from outer space.
And I mean, when SG-1 came out, Stargate, with the Egyptian god spaceship landing on the pyramid because it was the landing pad. Of course, it went, you know, all the conspiracy theories were going, look, Egypt, this proves the point.
Ancient aliens.
Yeah.
Oh
I
no,
love
please. So let's dry it away from that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get some play.
I'm quite keen, when I write, I'm very keen on archetypes. I'm quite Jungian in my thought. Now, archetypes are sort of patterns that all, well, people who think like I do believe, but it may or may not be correct. But this way of thinking suggests that all humanity has certain patterns of need and of development in our psychology. You're familiar with tarot cards. Now, tarot cards are fairly aligned with this way of thinking. You have, you know, the mother, the maiden, the crone, the magician, the rebel, the hero, those sorts of patterns. And some social anthropologists and social psychologists have looked at folklore and legend and myth all across the world, and they believe, and it's open to dispute as everything is, that these patterns repeat themselves. And not only do we need to feel empowered, we need to feel reassured, so therefore my character only will dance with her green silk shawl, somebody will only wear odd socks or whatever, because it gives you a sense of control when everything else is scary and too big. But also, I think most stories, I'm biased, most decent stories do follow archetypical patterns. There's a guy called Joseph Campbell, and in, I think, the 1930s, he wrote a book called The Hero's Journey. Do read the abridged edition. The full edition will take quite a while and is quite an effort. But this analyses how the same patterns go across most known cultures. And I think not only do we need that empowerment, sense of control, sense of we have got, magic is a feeling that we have got some control over the situation, but also these patterns do tend to be things that we gravitate to, and making stories to try and make sense of life.
I would really recommend knowing about Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. It's in his book called The Hero with a Thousand, Hero of a Thousand Faces.
That's right, sorry, The Hero of a Thousand Faces.
I want to come back and argue a mechanistic point of view to that. So first, I think we need Mark Tracy's opinion on.
Well, I was just going to touch on the Jungian psychology approach, because Jungian psychology has fallen out of favour with a lot of people in more recent times, but I'd argue that in terms of folklore and folklorists, it very much hasn't. And a lot of the ideas behind, not only behind archetypes, but behind the whole idea of a collective subconscious or a folk memory, really hold true somehow in a lot of ways. So, for example, in my book on spectral black dogs, I talk about this quite a lot, and the idea that because the dog is so embedded in our culture, it was the first domesticated animal that means so much to us, that within our own collective folk memory it has this importance, which means that over the 1,000 or so years that people had reported sightings of ghostly black dogs, they used the same terminology without knowing about the folklore necessarily. So we have examples over many, many decades where people describe the same things using the same attributes, using the same descriptors, but culturally within the time period they're in. So as big as a calf, for example, is one that comes up time and time again. It might be as big as a calf, as big as a Newfoundland, as big as a donkey in older stories. It's as big as a wolf in more modern ones. but the same descriptor comes up time and time again. Eyes like saucers is another one. And you see these common threads from people who have reported sightings to me from the late 90s, 2000s, for example, who have no knowledge, thought that their sighting was unique, that it was not something that other people had shared, then realised that actually sightings go back to the 12th century. It is a very running thing.
You say they're not aware of it.
Hmm.
Are they aware of it because they've heard a story in passing and haven't realised they've taken it in?
Well, I mean, arguably that could be the case, but I would also argue that over the 1,000+ examples of stories that I've got in my archive, for example, that so many of them come up with this sort of recurring theme, that the laws of coincidence diminish over time quite significantly, and there's possibly more to it than that. So I don't think we can write off, like a lot of people do, the Jungian approach to these things. I think in terms of folklore, it's really quite valid.
And in terms of story writing, it does give you an extremely solid background for your work.
Mm.
I think something I was going to say when you were talking about folklore, and I think it's deconstruction of fallen stars, which was always supposed to be the last episode of Babylon 5, but with the problems about getting the 5th season and things like that, it was shown at the end of season 4. But that episode talks about how an event becomes a story and develops it literally to the point that you've almost got at the end of it an Anglo-Saxon chronicle, where you've got Sheridan's drawn like as a character, like as a medieval, well, as a Dark Ages character that you'd see in like the Anglo-Saxon's chronicle, with like his face and it all curves round into an S, and he's got like knightly garb on that you would associate with fighters then. So you've taken a science fiction story, and they do the whole episode goes right the way through about how stories can be changed, perverted, and even then become the most basic. Now, I mean, I was thinking about when you were mentioning magicians. Now, my background is medical, so that if you were to take a situation where we've got the medical advances that we've currently got, and if there was a collapse of society and things like that, and you still had certain people who still could keep the medical, they would basically become known as magicians, because they have a certain knowledge that becomes thought of as magical rather than science.
And there's a great example, because the first sighting of a black dog was reported in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. There you go.
But I mean, it's excellent if you want to think about how stories can be changed over time. So it has a political influence, it has a revisionary influence, and it goes right the way through to this point. And it's really worth watching for that reason.
J. Michael Straczynski wrote Babylon 5. Was very much interested in it. It's the King Arthur story in a lot of ways. So you can see him, I don't know, just deconstructing his process in the writing of it, taking a myth and retelling it in a new environment.
Which he actually did of B5 with Michael York,
Yeah.
when he actually turned up as a knight.
Yeah.
I was going to say that's exactly what I do with the 7 myths that I've written. Because the first one is the story of the Tree of Life, except I tell it in a sort of mystical space world with dragons.
So that's the element of taking a story and retelling it in a different environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Taking one step away from reality as well.
Or as Robert E. Howard did with his sort of normally they're flashbacks, they're deep memories of an ancient ancestor, and they're fighting degenerate, reptile people who degenerated and worship strange ancient gods, or you have the Picts fighting the Romans. Of the Bratback Morn stuff is sort of pulped up folklore in a way.
And you have to consider with, so Beth and I were talking about this before we started the panel properly, you have to consider what the purpose of these stories is. Well, are they moralistic? Are they portentous? Are they teaching you something as a warning? You know, lots of folklore surrounding rivers and waterways are stories that come up as a warning, which is essentially, that's a deep lake, don't go and fall in it. Bottomless pool legends all come about, well, in the main, come about as older warnings to keep children or other people away from dangerous bodies of water. So there's lots of different reasons why stories develop, and usually there is a purpose behind them.
I mean, you've got to say, why do Homo sapiens and our ancestors before that have stories and tell the stories? And there must be a survival advantage to it. So if a tribe has stories and therefore won't fall into the bottomless pool, less of them will drown versus a tribe which doesn't have stories and therefore drowns a lot more.
There's also, as I was talking about my books, yesterday, if you can take one step away from reality, then it's easier to look back at a problem, and the story that either you make up yourself or someone tells to you helps you make sense of that problem. So when you go back and face reality, you have a mechanism in place. Now, if you consider a fly on the bottom of a shoe, that fly will think it's on a great black plane. If the fly can move away and fly around the room, it'll go, oh, it's only him. You know, I'll land on his nose or whatever. Or he's going to swat me, he's got a newspaper, I'm going to fly out the window. If you are too close to a problem, or a young person or an inexperienced person, it's very, very, very difficult to make sense of things. And I think psychologists call it vicarious storytelling, where it actually, as you were saying, teaches you something. But because you are able to move away from the situation and look at it in other terms, through folklore, through a story, you can make sense of it in a safe place. And then when you're back in the situation, you've sort of rehearsed how it all goes, and you know that if you're walking through the woods and somebody comes up and says, hello, what are you doing here? You run like hell, you don't tell them where you're going. The Little Red Riding Hood. So it's psychologically, it's hugely important that we have these myths and folklore.
It's 1:45, so I suppose questions and answers from the audience, unless there's any point to follow on that.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, one at the back.
So the myth about going near the water, where did the Lady of the Lake come from? Because you need to go near the water to get the sword.
Do you want to answer
No,
that?
carry on.
In Celtic times, if things were difficult, you would make an offering to the gods, and quite often things like swords would be thrown into the water. They'd often be put beyond use, not always. I use it in Stonekeeper. Now, the Lady of the Lake, I think, and I'm sure you can correct me, Mark, is, again, in Celtic mythology, springs and lakes often have a green goddess associated with just that place.
Yeah.
And so, if Merlin, and I'm acting as if it's all real, was familiar with the area, he may well have known that offerings had been made in pre-Roman times, and he, in folkloric sense, would have known how to have spoken to the green goddess, the spirit of that water, and she, because she was working for right, for good, would have either pointed out or produced the sword.
And water's important, water's important in lots of different ways. So we saw, like in the Roman times, in places like Coventina's Well, for example, and other holy wells that have offerings and things like that. In terms of Cornish witchcraft, there's sprawl, isn't it? Which sprawl is the energy that resides within water, which
It's within, the sprawl is within the entire landscape. There's different types of it, but so there is a type of water.
yeah, and you can, energy that you can harness, and obviously flowing water is flowing energy in that way. So water's really important in lots of different ways.
It's also important, especially in the early times, early metalworking. Blacksmith was the equivalent of a magician in his own right, because he could forge. And of course, to make the blade temper, you quench it in water. No, yeah. Today, yes, not then.
But we all know that blacksmiths got their power from the devil.
Yeah.
But there's anybody who is skilled in that way, anybody who has a particular skill like that, it has to have come from supernatural origins, because that's what puts them above everybody else. It's why blacksmiths, weavers, those sorts of people who had these crafts were often, outcasts in another respect in society later on, although they needed for those things to.
On a slightly different tack, what about the sort of folklore and mythology of the Great Burning, the witchcraft hunt through Europe? Because you get there were only 200 people burned at the stake, or there were 2 million people burned at the stake. How can you narrow it down because a lot of it wasn't recorded? Where do you fall on the spectrum of being very naughty people who hated women? I know this is a podcast, so I'm using this word.
Well, I think with the witch hunts, a lot of that was due to a lot of mass hysteria, because it just, particularly in Europe, particularly in Scotland, it spread like wildfire. Scotland was exceptionally good at keeping records, much better than England. And so a lot of what we know of the witch trials, the stereotypical witch trial where there was some torture and then there was interrogation and then there was a trial and then there was, in Scotland, burning at the stake or hanging. A lot of what we've kind of applied to other cases does come from what we know from Scottish records, because they were just so good at recording things. They were
James VI was a
exactly prime
very,
example.
very
Prime example. He got
twisted
involved with the North Berwick case, because obviously they had attacked him personally when he was trying to collect Anne of Denmark, so he could marry her.
of course, because storms.
So he had a personal stake in it.
There are obvious examples of mass hysteria. Salem is
I was about to bring that up. It's surprising, isn't it, when people started emigrating abroad, they took it with them.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
And
Folklore migrates.
but there is actually also a very good reason why Salem became as bad as it did, because in the Pendle case, they relied at that point on the evidence of a 9-year-old girl who was giving evidence against, I believe, her mother and her aunt.
Actually, several members of the family.
Well, there was, but primarily, but the Justice's handbook of the time permitted a child that young to give evidence. And that was the book which everybody on the Mayflower took with them to America. So, of course, they were in America, were doing their own thing. They had this book, which in England had been updated so that children that young could not give evidence. I think at all. It might have been just against their own family, but there was something prohibiting children's evidence being taken into consideration when they were that young. But in America, they had the original Justice's instruction book, and that was what they went on. So, of course, when Salem happened, their instructions said, yeah, it's absolutely fine to take this young girl's evidence as read. And so, of course,
spectral evidence as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so, of course, because they were working on this outdated book, they did take the evidence from the young girl and killed it.
Mass hysteria is a fascinating thing, though, if you look at it in sort of different aspects. and not just in those negative aspects. The mass hysteria, which is essentially what it was, that surrounded the death of Princess Diana was a prime example. You know, the gates of Kensington Palace became what has become the largest ever site of, you know, the contemporary ritual depositing of items. If you think back to the time of Diana's death, and people from all over the world going to Kensington Palace and leaving items there.
Well, and Buckingham Palace as well.
And Buckingham Palace, yeah. And it developed from people who had, you know, an obvious connection with her to people who didn't, to people who probably never would have given it a second thought, until suddenly it becomes a mass outpouring of grief, and it develops in exactly the same way as other sorts of mass hysteria did.
With Princess Diana, do you think, I mean, she was literally a princess? I wonder if that it plugged into something primeval within our everybody's culture and folklore.
I think a lot of it had to do with not only the way that she conducted herself, but the people that she interacted with and the way that she interacted with them. So if you think about her going and shaking hands with AIDS victims, going to landmine areas, things like that. It's what I was saying about this idea about resonance and identity. You can identify with her as somebody who is working closely and sympathising with people of your status, of your class, of your community, of those around you. And you think about the other members of the royal family and the way that they conduct themselves in similar scenarios. They're very, very different things. I think it's this identification process that had a lot to do with that.
It's touching the leper, isn't it?
I think there's a negative one as well, I've just realised. A lot of the problems of American school shootings is because there is a script by which the shooters can follow. There is a myth to follow which they make a video of it and so forth. So there's a mythical story that they can follow to do it, so therefore it's more likely to happen.
There's another folklore that also occurs as well, the one around dates. If you remember the panic over, oh my God, when we reach the year 2000, all our computers will blow up.
Yes. Yeah.
And the panic that was rampaging around the world on that, and that was a date.
Yeah, an awful lot of work did go on to making sure that nobody actually...
That's true, because I did some of it as well. Yeah, we all do some of it.
Yeah. But it was the hysteria about it.
Yeah.
Slight change of that. I was going to mention, Salem was mentioned. I've got an ancestor who was actually dead by the time of Salem witchcraft trials, but he was a puritanical bigot who had people who chewed tobacco, flogged, he hung Quakers, but he was all based in that Salem area, so that when they had landed, there was a settlement. But the thing about Salem that's always interested me, and it was an investigation early 1800s, was that when it was actually, they landed there, certain families got access to water rights and other ones didn't, so that they created the witchcraft thing in order to try and take the land away. However, the question I want to ask, and maybe we just say this is development of tales over time, what does the panel think about perversion of fairy tales by Disney turning them into sucrose, sugary, giving girls false ideas and...
Mark, you're the expert.
I don't know that it's a different treatment of a traditional story at the end of the day. And stories change and develop for many different reasons. In terms of the Disneyfication of stories, in some respects, it's a positive thing because it allows you to share a story that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily share. You know, you probably wouldn't sit down with your 5-year-old kids and tell them the actual denouement of The Little Mermaid in the way that it's written, for example. Because they probably run out of the room pretty never come back.
But in all fairness, is that something that the way that we've now been brought up? Because I can remember, you know, Big Children's Hour television stories in the 1970s. They did show.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I mean, you've only got to look at children's television throughout the 70s and 80s to realise that actually they should be taking it like that again now, because it's so much more.
So they're basically all of us in the 70s who watched it. We've all got PTSD.
Yeah, absolutely. But we all come together in places like this and share it, so it's fine.
I'm awfully sorry, but you're all going to have to run out screaming because we're out of time. I'd like to thank the panel. Got final thoughts?
My final thought was, are we going to all sit here at lunchtime and do a folklore book signing, which was what we talked about earlier on?
Indeed. We never had time to do signings, Tracy and I, for our books when we launched them, so we're going to do a signing at 12 o'clock-ish here, I guess. Or in the opening as well.
You're still here, Beth?
I am supposed to be leaving soon, so if it is going to happen at 12, let me know, and then I can readjust.
It is going to happen at 12.
It is going to happen at 12.
Thanks. Please, everybody thank the panel in the usual way.
I would like to recommend Mark's book,